Welcome back to Paranormal Now. I'm your host, Alan B. Smith, as we traverse the paranormal highway of cosmic landmines and who knows what else. Tonight's guest is none other than Carole Carle, who is quite infamous on the Inception Radio Network. She does the UFO headline news there, and she's also been a host for Epic Voyages Radio, and I'm pretty sure she can correct me later that she's also hosted and co-hosted some of the other shows on Inception Radio Network as well. So tonight we're going to be talking about something extraordinarily interesting, and I mean that truly, because the way I would describe this would be a haunting story, a paranormal story, a psychic story that if Sherlock Holmes could have a story, a novel that spanned over years or decades, this would be a great Sherlock Holmes novel, because the mystery is not simply someone had a paranormal experience. We can or cannot explain it. The story behind the Fox sisters continues or has continued for quite some time. So Carole Carle will dive into that world soon, but as a friendly reminder, you can always listen to the Inception Radio Network, even if it's not this podcast, any other show on the live stream broadcast at inceptionradionetwork.com, or you can listen to it on Live 365, Stitcher Radio, Nobex Radio, TuneIn, iTunes Radio, Streama, Shoutcast, Winamp, WinMedia Player, and QuickTime. And of course, we replay shows also on Roku. And if you're really, really hurting and you need an IRN fix, because otherwise your day just won't be a good one, you can always call 401 from your cell phone or landline, 401-283-6700, and you can listen to the live stream there as well. Carole, welcome to Paranormal
Alan,
Now.
Hello, I'm having to stifle my guffaws. Notorious, infamous, I guess I am. Yikes, and I just love, the fact that since, people listen in podcast, we've got Paranormal Now and Paranormal Now Later. You decide.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so it's very cool, but this is the now. Yes, the Fox sisters. Where to begin? Possibly the fact that the very geolocation was haunted in a sense during from the 1780s on. It was sort of a hotspot for the development of brand new religions. In fact, it became called the burnt over district because religions would rise so quickly and spread like wildfire and then depart, be unsuccessful. And some of them, one religion that was very successful came from the nearby area of Palmyra, which is the Joseph Smith Mormon connection. But the territory, specifically Wayne County in New York, it was originally, I'm going to read this, originally included in lands of Ontario and Seneca counties, New York. It became a separate county April 11th, 1823, but the history goes way, way back, early Native Americans. Lots of artifacts that seem to date back as far as 10,000 years ago. So it was an occupied area. Ultimately, French fur traders, Jesuit missionaries, etc., made visits to that area. The burnt over district. And any questions so far? Did that was that coherent?
Yeah, absolutely coherent.
Okay.
I understood.
All right. Well, then hopefully all of our gentle listeners, as I refer to them on the UFO headline news, will also be getting this. It's interesting. There is quite an overlap in terms of marginalization, just downright mudslinging besmirchment of UFO followers, enthusiasts, ufologists even. And there's a parallel with what happened to the Fox sisters and early spiritualists. I don't want to say it was conspiracy. It was definitely conspiratorial, but there were overt qualities. It was an attempt to just sort of undermine and trivialize the entire thing. So there are parallels in that from the then to the now. But one of the original things that I feel kind of compelled to correct about the Fox sisters is a lot of sites on the internet, and I began looking into this about 15 years ago, maybe 18. A lot of sites will have misinformation. I won't go as far as to say disinformation, but the first takeaway I had of the Fox family was that they were poor itinerant peppermint farmers who had sought shelter, lodging in this sort of a cabin cottage situation in Hydesville, New York. Well, that just wasn't the case. In fact, the eldest son, David, was married to Elizabeth Culler, whose family had definite big holdings in the area of Hydesville. Hydesville, New York, was settled by Henry Hyde, and he also, it was called the Hydesville Cottage because he was the landowner and the landlord there. The Fox family, Maggie and Kate, who were 13 and 15, and John and Margaret, their parents, were simply staying there while their bigger house was being built nearby. And so right out of the gate, part of the misinformation was that Leah, the eldest sister, somehow was then able to teach piano, and that was a work demons, something she had summoned up. They were called witches, etc.
So she wasn't formally taught.
No, she was. They were educated, and they decided to educate their daughter in various, of the niceties, as was befitting. Something else that's a curious thing, you'll often see Leah, well, this was her entire name, Anne Leah Fox Fish Brown Underhill. Yep.
Wow.
Well, the Anne Leah Fox Fish, Mr. Fish, I believe his first name was Benjamin, was her first husband. And here's something that's kind of like in terms of modern concepts, it wasn't unusual for even a well-placed daughter, to be married very early. And at the age of just past 14, Anne Leah married Benjamin Fish, who ultimately, after 2 years and leaving her with a daughter named Lizzie, took off for parts unknown. Legend has it he ended up in California, but who knows. So here we have, at the height of the coming to public knowledge Fox sisters situation, Anne Leah was 24 and had a 10-year-old daughter. So it's interesting because her youngest sister, Kate, Maggie, was 13 at that point. So, that was an interesting contrast. And it's something that, I suppose fits into, well, they were anomalous, look at their behavior, but it just fell in line with the times. She, in fact, Leah, was not even in residence at the initial rappings. Here, shall I go? Is this the part where we go into how it fell out?
Yeah, I'd say just keep on going. This is very interesting to hear the backstory. Right.
Well, it's something that, there are many versions. They're all just slightly different. The one that I stick with is per an attorney. In fact, his name was E. Lewis Esquire out of Canandaigua, New York, and he showed up on the scene and actually made, their testimonies. He deposed all of the main players. Somehow or another, we managed to get our hands on a reprint of this manuscript, which, that was kind of a stopper.
What was his name again? His first name?
His name is E. Lewis. E.W.I.S.
E. Lewis. Got it. Okay.
Right. Esquire. Don't forget the Esquire, because I'm sure he never did. But the setting, it was sort of the general store, kind of just like the movies. He set up a desk and began to take testimony of all the main witnesses of the night. The night was March 31st, 1848. It wasn't the first set of rappings. They actually began in December of that year, of actually 47, before the family moved in. In fact, there had been another family in residence in the same cottage, which was a 2-bedroom, 1 large main room, something underneath called the buttery, a basement, and that's pivotal. It by no means was, in disrepair. It was a very livable situation. They moved in, and shortly thereafter, they began to hear what was described as rappings. These would increase whenever Father would read the Bible, which was often. And they played it off John Fox said it's a local cobbler who's brought some work home, to finish late at night, or perhaps it's rats. There was a nearby creek called the the Garangua. That was the creek. And it was thought that perhaps there was water moving underground. And yes, there was, but that's for later. The rappings continued and reached a height. They seemed to take place. They seemed to begin on the outside of the front door after the family had gone to sleep. It became so spooky for the girls that they all slept in one main room together. And this particular night, March 31st, they went to sleep early because they had been awakened previous nights. And Margaret, especially the mother, was becoming just almost ill from this constant interruption of her sleep. So that night, the girls were awakened first by the rapping. They awakened their parents. And at that point, the youngest daughter said, "Mother, it's April Fool's Day tomorrow. This is surely someone playing an April Fool's trick." It wasn't. And at some point, Katie got the inspiration to clap her hands in a numerical fashion. And the claps were heard in response. And then she made claps that didn't quite connect. She would put her hands, but not quite together. And this was followed by the number of raps she would have made. And at some point she said, "Oh, look, Mother, it can see as well as hear."
Wow. So it was imitating? Is that?
Imitating, yes.
Yeah.
Imitating in response.
See, that's so odd, because that's definitely atypical for most, casual reports, people who have had, mild haunting or poltergeist experiences. It's more of something that's happening to you, but there's very little interaction like that. That's very intelligent.
Exactly. Intelligent. That is the word. And there are accounts that the girls decided to play a prank on their parents. They were bored. They tied an apple with a string to the end of a stick and hit it against the wooden floor to fool their parents. That's just not the case. Absolutely not the case. They might have done that, and then, of course, there's this, you could treat it like they did it and then they got the wit scared out of them because something rapped back. But ultimately, that's not even part of the main story, the trickery. The girls at one point were accused of rapping the knuckles, the joints of their toes or their knees to make these popping, rapping sounds. In fact,
oh my, that's crazy.
Well,
I mean, maybe it's possible, but I don't know. That's
okay. Here's a little personal anecdote that my children would just both, absolutely slay me for, but I'm going to do it anyway. During my research and occasionally, the family dinner time conversations about this, I mentioned that, and within the next few days, standing quietly in some room, both of them were playing it off. They were making their toe joints pop, Alan. They were, and it was reverberating, through our wood floors and the joists, etc. of our old house. And they were looking at each other like, "What's that? What the?" Oh my God. Well, yeah. So in other words, I can say this was possible.
I guess what surprises me is the decibel, that it could possibly reach, because I can crack my one of my toes, my big toes on my foot, like all day long. I can just crack it, but it's not that loud. Maybe if I was snapping, like we do with our fingers, but using my toes, maybe that would be louder. But it doesn't seem like it would reverberate in such a way that I would think, oh, it's coming from the wall, or I don't know.
Right. Well, this in the case of my children, this was pretty clearly coming from the floor area.
They have skills.
Yeah, they definitely. It's in their skill set. Yikes. Well, what can I say about that? They come by it naturally.
Well, You're an entertainer at your heart, so I'm sure that they've got some of that from you.
Hey, it's just the variety of their great grandfather's soft shoe. Yeah.
Oh,
okay.
Nice.
but ultimately, just to interject, in the final analysis, the girls were bound, and I'll get into that in a bit. They were bound in such a way during this huge. They were called out And during this calling out on stage, etc., they were bound in such a way that couldn't possibly have been done. There also, though, is some professor from an Eastern university who in the 1890s said, well, that's what they were doing. They were wrapping their toe. People flew in the face of what was evidentiary. And that is such a parallel to ufology. It's just that kind of stops me. It's an amazing thing. So the night of March 31st, 1848, the neighbors were called in. First, a Mrs. Redfield, who was at first thinking that someone was ill, and then she thought that the girls were playing a trick. This would have been, probably after midnight sometime. And I'm just gathering that everybody probably pretty much went to bed not too long after the sun went down. So Mrs. Redfield, the neighbor, was there, and her husband joined her. And it got a little humorous because it's like an old I Love Lucy show. Apparently, Mrs. Redfield had never told her husband what her true age was. The spirit rapped her true age. And, much humor and hilarity ensued, I'm sure. But there was another sad but extremely convincing note. Margaret Fox had lost a child some years previous, and not even her husband had known. God was the only person who knew, if you will. And
do you know how she lost the child?
It was a miscarriage before the child was born, before she was even evidently pregnant, before it was visible to her husband. And she had it was a heartbreak for her, and so she never mentioned it. And yes, but spirit knew. There eventually came about a situation to ease the communication delays. Initially, it started out as, one rap for letter A, two for et cetera, and that was so time-consuming. Older brother David stepped in and came up with a kind of yes and no response, a 1 and 2 rap. And the spirit rapped out that he was the spirit of a murdered peddler, Charles B. Rosna, spelled R-O-S-N-A. You'll also see that misspelled R-O-S-M-A. And I don't know what that, I suppose it could be the stroke of a pen in somebody's interpretation, but it was R-O-S-N-A. He was a peddler, and that's absolutely substantiated. At the time of his death, which had been 3 years previously, in 1843, he was married and had 5 children. His wife ultimately died shortly after he did. I was never, to my frustration, able to track down any of the children. They were Jewish, and there was this wonderful thing of being taken into the community at large and nourished and cherished that way. So that could account for the fact that in all the orphanage records I could never find that name. A sad tale. He was murdered for the sum of $500, which was stitched inside the lining of his jacket. He was a peddler of household notions. And in fact, on the day of his death, he had stopped by this cottage later occupied by the Fox family. Oh, I've left a fact out. Let's just sort of do a jump back. The Fox family and their 2 daughters were not the first family with husband, wife, and 2 daughters to occupy that space. There was another family, their last name was Weekman, and they stayed there just a few short months because one night their youngest daughter was awakened from her sleep. She felt a cold hand touch her face. And that just became so incredibly traumatic, obviously, for them. They decided to leave, and they left. To me, it's kind of as though the spirit of Charles B. Rosna, which was on the property, somehow or another, the communication was supposed to take place through 2 young girls. These just weren't the right 2 girls.
Okay.
And genetically, as far as DNA is concerned, Margaret's grandmother and mother both had histories of being able to foretell. They would know when someone who was not at all ill. They would have a dream and visualize their funerals, etc.
Right. Well, what is the right? What makes the right girls?
The right girls. Well, you see, that's where I was going with the DNA.
Gotcha.
Some
Okay.
sort of a predisposition to at least not dismiss this out of hand, or to say this is the devil's work, we can't do this. I'm not sure if they had, if it would have stopped, because this thing that they did not bring upon themselves, nor did they particularly feel comfortable with it, it just persisted.
So that brings us back to forward. Are we going forward again?
Yes, forward. I kind of went back.
Okay.
Okay. Forward too. So we're in that night, and we're with the communication. Word spread like wildfire. There obviously the Morse code wasn't quite on the scene, and this was also, by the way, referred to as God's telegraph, which
God's
is interesting. The spiritual contact. Yeah. And so, as I said,
so can we have like God's text messages too now? Can we do that?
Say, why not? Yeah. Well, I guess God's helpers, etc. The Pope, everybody tweets. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Good, bad, or indifferent. Tweets fly on wings.
Yes, they do. Yeah, they do.
They do. Yeah. So let's see. My train of thought just flew.
I'm sorry. I threw that out.
No, I love it.
I love it.
But, yeah, exactly. Okay. How word spread was just, word of mouth. And people came from 300 miles away. They came on horseback, by foot, by carriage. There was digging going on by the principal players in the cottage, because it was revealed by Charles B. Rosner's spirit that his body had been hidden in the cellar next to the buttery, which was a colder spot, obviously a place used to keep dairy products, etc. Dirt floors were kind of, especially in basements, wasn't anything unusual. It didn't bespeak necessarily poverty to have a dirt floor in your basement. And in fact, later, one of the working girls, Lucretia Pulver, who had been on site the night of Charles B. Rosner, the peddler's last visit to that place, she said that after that, the owner or the current renter for whom she worked of that place, had a habit of working late at night, carrying rocks to and from the cellar. So what was that all about? She was also given a torn coat, ripped on the inside. The lining was torn. And she was given this coat by the missus and asked to please alter it to fit her husband. That was Charles B. Rosner's coat. And Lucretia Pulver's testimony is that part of that taken by the attorney, E.E. Lewis. So he stops at the cottage, which is occupied. The man's name was John C. Bell, not to be confused with a New York senator of the same era who was named John Bell. John C. Bell and his wife, whose name is unknown, they were the occupants. Their working girl, Lucretia Pulver, had wanted to buy some fabric from Charles B. Rosner. She didn't have the money with her because they hadn't paid her. And so she went to her home not too far away, and she said she would arrive with the money the next day. The peddler said he'd be back, and he was never back. The way my husband and I have written it for the musical that someday might be finished is that he was invited in for dinner and drugged. And the hardest part to write is the fact that he was beheaded. They slit his throat and caught the blood in crockery. Part of the haunting is an auditory haunting, the sound of gurgling and the sound of crockery breaking. And indeed, shards of crockery were found as they dug in the cellar. The crowds that came to see the digging in the cellar, a woman even jumped hoop skirt and all through the kitchen window.
Crowds came.
Crowds came. Wow. The Fox family had to vacate.
So no yellow tape, and it's just
yeah, exactly. Yeah. No helicopters, no film at 11, no footage, nothing on YouTube.
Just like a free for all. I mean, that's what it sounds like, right?
It was a free for all, but some of the major players who were the diggers were well placed within the community, and they dug until they came to water, which I'm remembering that is about a little over 3 feet down, and the Garnagua, the nearby creek, apparently was making inroads, so they had to stop. But they did find bones, which, if only we had, the DNA then. They found bones that were of an unknown origin, and they found bits of crockery with hair, also of unknown origin, stuck to them. Yeah. So that's it. And so at that point, the family, they decamped to Rochester, New York. Leah and her daughter, the two sisters, and Mother Margaret, and a family friend named Calvin Brown. This is an interesting character. He was about a decade younger than Leah. His mother had been the best friend of Margaret, Leah's mother, and upon her death, it was sort of, they wanted to take care of Calvin, and the way they took care of him was he got married to Leah, who by that time was had divorce papers or whatever, maybe just the grass widow thing of her first husband, Mr. Fish. And so that's where she became Anne Leah Fox Fish Brown. That was the part of the saga. He was in residence on Troop Street in Rochester for an awful lot of the activities that went on there. Lots of hauntings. It went with them. It followed them. They took a packet boat on the Erie Canal. And, the night boat to Newark. And they took it and got off and were in Rochester, then New York. Down the street, not too far away, was the home of Frederick Douglass and his daughter Rosetta. Very huge in abolitionism, obviously movers and shakers. And the situation was that they came to the aid of the girls, as did a couple of prominent Quakers, Isaac and Amy Post, also locals. Horace Greeley was one of their sponsors, James Fenimore Cooper. The list of names who supported them and their endeavors and found them to be authentic, is a little staggering.
That is staggering. So, we're going to just have a couple more minutes here before we have to go to the first break. But I just wanted to jump in and share, because you had mentioned it, that you and your husband have been working on a musical based on this story. So how long have you been working on it, and when are we going to hear it?
Oh my God. Anybody's guess. I would like to say sooner rather than later. It's one of those things that just the business of living sometimes gets in the way. So it's been fits and starts. We have 2.5 acts. At this point, it looks as though to make it 3 is going to be just, too much for everybody. And so it's going to be a solid 2 at this point. So it's, once again, it's the editing, the reworking. Fortunately, there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's got something along the lines of 20 to 24 songs, and that could be trimmed.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if we all have learned something from Andrew Lloyd Webber, sometimes a little trimming's okay.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Bring me my scissors.
Right.
It's an important important part of the process, and you can't let ego get in the way. Could be a good song, but not for here.
Well, let's hold it right there, and we'll pick up with the story and more about the Fox sisters when we get back. This is Alan B. Smith on Paranormal Now. I'm speaking with Carole Carle from the Inception Radio Network, and hold on, we'll be right back. Welcome back to Paranormal Now. My host is Carole Carle, and taking us out of the break was White Flag by Dido. So Carole, we were talking about the Fox sisters, obviously.
Yes.
Quite the interesting backstory leading up. So we're picking up in Rochester, New York. This would have been about 1849. Okay. They were ensconced in a nice 2-story place with sufficient space for Maggie, Leah, Anne, Leah, and Margaret when she visited. I left out a pivotal thing about Margaret. During the initial contact with the neighbors and all the ensuing chaos, Margaret's hair is reported to have turned white overnight. Wow. Okay. Now we do know though that isn't that actually possible? I've heard both ways. Yes, I've heard that it could happen. Right. I spoke with a wonderful woman who, and in fact, I relayed this to her about Margaret, and she said that that's not surprising to her. She apparently knew somebody who was in military service, and I don't even remember which war,
who had that happen in some sort of incredible, tense, life-threatening situation. The next day, his hair was white. So I don't know. There are those who say that's scientifically impossible.
It isn't, because it is a dead particle. It's not like it's not like your skin. Technically,
Right.
it's dead. So how could it possibly change?
Right.
I don't know.
It's not like getting a bruise. Right. So I don't know. I suppose this is nonsense, but it's the blurry possibility that Margaret perhaps was coloring her hair with some herb or root, and that at some point she just gave it up because it was too much involving, regarding the situation they found themselves in. So I
do wonder, because yes, people say, well, you would have to dye your hair, right? But if you get a tattoo removed, they're using lasers. So if I'm gonna stretch the speculation, maybe electrical force running through your body might actually have sort of some effect on the pigment.
Oh my
so
gosh.
if you're getting shocked or something, because right, I mean that's how you get rid of tattoos. It's lasers.
So some sort of as yet unknown electrical thing using the human body, and then of course there's that thing about spirits who manifest so that they're visible. There's that traditional cold spot where it is also thought that the cold spot is produced because the entity needs energy, and in drawing their energy from the air, they're creating cold. I wish I had a better chemical background to address the science of this. Yeah.
But it's interesting. Okay, so her hair turns white.
Right. So meanwhile, hair white or no, she is in the city of Rochester with her daughter and her granddaughters, her granddaughter and her other daughters. It's an interesting overlap historically with what was going on with Frederick Douglass and others and abolition, and with the feminist movement. In fact, just about, I think, early April after this March 31st rapping that, which was the great coalescence of everything, there was the first feminist convention in Seneca Falls. And Amelia Bloomer and her husband, who had a newspaper called Lily and Sesame, I believe was the title. They were definitely supporters of the Fox sisters. And that's something we interject into the musical, because who can resist, Amelia Bloomer, who brought us bloomers? Yeah, that's just too much to resist. So, but they had great supporters. There was such an overlap in interests between feminists and abolitionists and spiritualists. And it was all happening in the same region of the United States and almost simultaneously. So something was up there. And it sort of filtered down. My take sort of is that at some point, and why don't we know as much about the spiritualist movement as those other two? I sort of think that perhaps it's possible spirits had, I don't know, some sort of a prime directive, and it was kind of, that's okay. The social aspects of what's going on planet Earth among the living need to be addressed more than our spirits. We're fine, thank you very much. And so it's interesting. The girls were asked in seance by spirit to hold a gathering at a place called Corinthian Hall in Rochester, which had just been completed. It was an enormous building, 4 columns out in front, majestic, and with a huge hall and a stage in the front. They were requested by spirits to hold this gathering in front of all kinds of locals and people highly placed in that community. They were also told to ask the wives of these community leaders to dress them in, quote, other people's clothes, so as to preclude any hidden objects that the girls could have had in their skirts, petticoats, right? Anything on their persons. Their ankles were bound. They were bound at the knees and ankles were covered with pillows, etc. Relatively barbaric. But they were up for it because they wanted to absolutely authenticate themselves. They wanted this, to be definitely something that they wanted to prove themselves. And so they did for 3 days, beginning November 11th, 1849, in Corinthian Hall, which sadly is no longer there. It's a parking lot, but it was the stage from which the girls ultimately were not able to be debunked. And mind you, right outside the lobby of this place, there were people waiting literally with tar and feathers. The girls were going to be tarred and feathered. And at one point before they left Hydesville, the cry went out to hang them as witches. They wanted them to be lynched. So this wasn't pretty.
Yeah. It still always dumbfounds me that people who believe in spirits want to condemn people who say they hear spirits. It's the most odd thing. It's
a great
it's so it's contradictory completely.
Yeah, exactly. And can I read you something? It's from Anne Leah Fox Fish Brown Underhill's book. She said that we regarded, this is how the family felt about what was going on. We regarded it as a great misfortune, as it was an affliction which had fallen upon us. How, whence, or why we knew not. The influence of the surrounding opinion of neighbors and the country round about reacted upon us in conformation of our whole own natural and educational impressions, that the whole thing was of evil origin, unnatural, perplexing, and tormenting. While its unpopularity tended to cast a painful shadow upon us, we resisted it, struggled against it, and constantly and earnestly prayed for deliverance from it, even while a strange fascination attached to these marvelous manifestations forced upon us against our will by invisible agencies and agents whom we could neither resist, control, nor understand. And they say that, she continues to say that if their wishes, their prayers had prevailed and availed, they would have put a halt to this. It really pretty much wrecked their lives.
Well, it's not unlike many story of women. They are victims of their circumstance, and then they're blamed for their circumstance.
Oh, yes. Definitely that was something at play. There's more misinformation out there kind of along those lines that
sure.
That Leah and Maggie worked for P.T. Barnum. The freak show aspect, there you are. There's, again, this besmirchment, this mudslinging. They actually, in fact, rented quarters, a suite in the P.T. Barnum Hotel in New York City, and that's where it just, really went awry.
What went awry exactly?
Where the misinformation came from, that they were on the road as part of P.T. Barnum, rather, before Bailey, road show, that there was, a freakish nature to this, to their presentation, and not true. In fact, at the Barnum Hotel, there was a séance in which James Fenimore Cooper was present, Horace Greeley, several other prominent citizens whose name escapes me, as does the name of the Episcopal minister who was present. He was extremely skeptical, but he wanted to see something for himself. So you can, set it at this point, the 1860s. And it was a situation where they sat around a table. One of the gentlemen had brought an envelope sealed, and in it was something of unknown origin. It was handed to Maggie, who began to get the feeling of what was in the envelope. And she said, "This is human hair. This is hair from an exceptional individual. He's small, he's mighty." Well, this was a snipping of hair that had been sealed previously in the envelope, unknown even to the minister who presented it. It was a clipping from a barber that had been swept up off the floor. It was the hair of Napoleon Bonaparte. Small but mighty, that just about does it, yes?
Small but mighty.
Yeah.
Okay. Wow.
Go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Another pivotal thing that happened historically, right before Charles B. Rosna's, I'm even stumbling on that, Charles B. Rosna's rappings made themselves apparent at the cottage, Niagara Falls stopped
I'm sorry?
dead. Yes, the falls at Niagara came to a complete and total halt. They froze. People were walking down in the area that was left just as frozen land. There were cannons, muskets, wheels of all kinds from antiquity. Essentially, what happened was that the folks in Buffalo woke up to the sound of silence, shall we say, the absence of that noise that accompanied their daily existence. Yeah. Meteorologically, it froze. At the time it was frozen, and right before it thawed and unfroze, and the water began to run again, it's during that silence that the rappings of Charles B. Rosna were heard. There's a long history, I guess, really back into antiquity, of water and the energy regarding spirits.
Well, how common is that water freezes anyway, specifically Niagara Falls? I mean,
that was kind of a first as far as I can tell. I remember stumbling upon it, and I found it independently. I was not, searching for something connected to the Fox sisters, but I tallied the dates, and it was like, whoa, pretty apparent that something was up. Specifically, the logical, real world explanation is that there was some sort of a freeze farther down the line that kept the water actually from, reaching its point where it would have been forceful enough to counteract that. Some sort of damming effect. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, obviously, if it's cold enough, water can freeze, and if the motion of the river is slowed enough, then that might be. But the coincidence there, it is quite odd.
Right. The timing. Yeah, the timing is really lovely. Yeah. So the girls were not tarred and feathered, and they, as I said, they at Corinthian Hall on those days, and they went forward and went to New York. Regarding the musical and the story that we follow, their lives just kind of became so unhappy, and we just don't have that kind of theatrical presentation in mind. It's more for the joy of the contact. And what this meant. But it's so interesting that Charles B. Rosna's name is not better known. I've spoken to people who say, whoa, that he's Moses, what's going on, or some other incredible contact from biblical times. But given the nature of spiritualism, which is a religion, and it's a very curious, one of its tenets is redemption for all.
Redemption for all.
For all.
Well, I mean, isn't that the same as Jesus Christ?
Yes, but this is without any kind of. You don't even have to sign on, or say amen. It's just something that no matter how awful your life has been, what your hideous deeds have been here, that there is redemption for all spirits.
I see.
So
okay.
That was
there's no verbally contractual or spiritual contractual caveat. It's just
no. That's right. It just goes with the territory of being alive.
Okay.
And then transitioning. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I'm not surprised that spiritualism and feminism are on the rise together, because at the same time, people. It seems to me that would be willing to, kind of risk the stigma of talking to or dealing with people who are non-Christian in their actions, maybe not in their hearts, but in their actions.
Right.
That would be counter-Catholic or counter, Baptist in these rituals. The people who would participate in that, I would assume were somewhat progressive in their thinking, as they did not abide by a confined dogma. And
yes.
And many of the people leading these spiritual sessions, I mean, there were men, but where it seems to me, at least from looking back on history, it was primarily women who were sort of moving the spiritualist movement forward.
Absolutely. That's a very great point that you make, the combination there of the timing of feminism. Yes, we were still in an era when women was sort of it was looked askance if they wanted to publish something they had written under their own names. Yeah.
I mean, look. Even really recently, I just finished The Chamber of Secrets, the second book of Harry Potter, and so I was reading about J.K. Rowling, and even now, this is the '90s, but they're like, well, let's use your initials just in case guys, boys won't want to read it because you're a woman.
That's a groaner.
And she went along with it, and financially things have worked out well for her, but it's a shame that even up until this day, these things are.
Yeah. Oh,
anyway,
it's another one of those last taboos. I am actually holding in my hand something that is the ultimate punchline, but first I'm getting there a little earlier. Let me back up just a little bit regarding the remains of Charles B. Rosna.
Sure.
Well, they were found, and with them was found a tin peddler's box, which to this day resides at Lilydale, the Lilydale Assembly in New York. Ongoing. In fact, I think probably they might be at the height of their season because of climate. They're not able to have year-round lectures, etc., conferences, but they do, and they do very well. People like Wayne Dyer, for instance, he spoke there at one point. But it's ongoing, and in fact, in order to occupy a dwelling, to own property in Lilydale, there's a test one has to pass, a test of mediumship, before you can even think about owning property there. They want to make sure they don't have, they're not hosting outward frauds.
Charlatans. Yeah.
Charlatans, indeed. So anyway, listen, this was something that really staggered me. There was a lot of stuff in the research I was doing that knocked my socks off. A couple of dates. The date of the incorporation, for instance, of Wayne County was April 11th, 1823. April 11th is my birthday. Not 1823. I'm a little younger than that. But also the date of all the depositions begun by that attorney who came to town, who came to Hydesville, E.E. Lewis, Esquire. Those were begun. Margaret's deposition was taken on April 11th. So it was kind of like, well, this is curious. But here's an article from the Boston Journal dated November 22nd, 1904. We're fast forwarding now. Rochester, New York. The skeleton of a man supposed to have caused the rappings, first heard by the Fox sisters in 1848, has been found in the walls of the house occupied by the sisters, and clears them from the only shadow of doubt held concerning their sincerity in the discovery of spirit communication. The discovery was made by school children playing in the cellar of the building in Hydesville, known as the Spook House, where the Fox sisters heard those wonderful rappings. William H. Hyde, a reputable citizen of Clyde, who owns the house, made an investigation and found an almost entire human skeleton between the earth and the crumbling cellar walls, undoubtedly that of the wandering peddler who it was claimed was murdered in the east room of the house and whose body was hidden in the cellar. Mr. Hyde has notified relatives of the Fox sisters, and the notice of the discovery will be sent to the National Order of Spiritualists, many of whom remember having made pilgrimage to that spook house, as it is commonly called. The finding of the bones practically corroborates the sworn statement made by Margaret Fox, April 11th, 1848. So there you have it. The bones were not found because initially they were looking in the floor of the cellar, when in fact John C. Bell, I'm pretty convinced he did it, with the help of his wife, that they put the body upright in the wall, so it just made a false wall around it.
So why wouldn't he communicate that more clearly?
That's an interesting question. That is a very interesting question. Yes?
Oh, no, I just wondered, is he just telling the initial, was there a miscommunication? Not miscommunication, I guess that it must have been, or
something lost in the translation.
Something lost in the translation, because as if that's where he was killed, and maybe that's initially where they were going to bury him and things changed. So maybe he told just that first part of that story to them. I don't know, but it seems odd that to cross that invisible dimension into ours, and
Yes.
to share that it wouldn't be specific enough. But then again, we're dealing with
Yeah,
something
that's a
that is
very interesting
odd.
point. That had not occurred to me, Alan. Thank you. That's something to ponder. Curious. And again, it speaks to, I don't know, too much Star Trek here, but is there a spiritual prime directive?
Maybe, or sometimes I do wonder if, oftentimes spirits really aren't the leftover souls, but are really just like residuals, like residual memories.
Right. Okay. As
kind
in
of stuck in the fabric,
imprinted, looping thing.
Looping. Sure.
Yeah.
So there's data there. There's something. There's information that person, a part of that person, is still functioning. A shadow of their mind is there, but not the actual spirit. I don't know.
Wow.
What do you think?
So in other words, just I don't know. I pretty much think that so many accounts I've heard and read of hauntings that fall into that category of residual, where we had guests over again, last night for bridge, and we watched the ghost walk through the kitchen wall again, that sort of thing, where it's a repetitive. Especially, the idea that whoever occupied whatever spirit is walking through that kitchen wall, maybe initially there was no wall there, etc. It was a doorway.
Right.
Yeah,
I think that's why some people like to differentiate between a ghost, aka ghost poltergeist, and a soul, the soul of a person, being something different than those two things.
Oh yeah, that's a hard one, because souls, my take is that souls are ancient.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm definitely on board for reincarnation. And it's so that.
So if souls are,
yes.
Yeah, I mean, if souls are ancient, then it wouldn't seem to me that they would get stuck in loops, in these sort of repetitive hauntings. If we do have a eternal or long-term existence or a process that we have to go through, but I don't know, maybe it's a pit stop, and you're kind of stuck in this in this little plane between planes for a while. I don't know. Wow.
I just, for some reason, I just pictured one of those hamster things, with all the tubes and tunnels. That's very curious, because then there's I just recently bumped into the concept that souls can occupy the same, one soul can be fragmented into many bodies simultaneously. That's a head spinner.
I mean, I don't like to believe that.
It would make sense. So it complicates stuff. Yeah,
it's already complicated enough. I don't know.
Please.
It's too much for me right now.
I know.
But so let's keep on talking then about the Fox sister. So what else happened then? This article that told the story that they actually found the body in the wall.
Right. From
when was that
Boston
article?
Journal. Yep.
When was it actually?
22nd, 1904.
1904. Okay.
Yep.
Okay. And so was there any notoriety after that because of the article?
Well, what happened, and I wish I had a better year on this. Oh, actually, wait a minute. Maybe I do. A sad thing, not these papers. Hold on. Let me shuffle some papers. Oh, what bad radio. No, not these papers. Sometime in the 1880s, Maggie had fallen upon hard times, and she also was struggling with alcoholism. Her father also struggled with it, so a genetic factor perhaps in there. But her life was very unhappy, and she had had a falling out with her sisters, Sister Kate and Sister Anne Leah. So she ultimately succumbed to the pressure that was being put on her by some disingenuous individuals who wanted her to retract her information, wanted her to testify, in fact, to put something in print, that this was all a hoax, that the girls indeed always had been faking it. They always had been popping their toe joints, knees, elbows, etc., and that there was no spirit contact. She did that, and almost immediately, from what I gather, felt bad about it, and ultimately, within the next perhaps 2 years, retracted that. And as is the case in many things, people read the initial, but they never read the correction or the retraction. It just doesn't. Yeah. So, and that's been, called the death knell of modern spiritualism. It sure, before it died, however, I have to say it went enormously big. There were seances, there was table tipping worldwide, and along came the First World War. So you had the tragedy of so many souls lost, often pathetically young souls, and parents grieving loved ones at home wanting to contact the spirits. Stanford University's Mrs. Stanford was one of those. Just a very interesting time to have all this, and it was international. There wasn't a country that didn't have a very well-known spiritualist. You're right, almost always female. And something happened, curiously, in the eastern part of the United States. There was a kind of a, I don't know, it was shall we say it was the reality TV aspect of life even way back then. Everybody who was anybody had a seance in their parlor after the pattern of the salons, yes. And so, to be invited, to Mrs. Franticaster's seance, and if you weren't going, well, you just weren't anybody. Yes,
well, let's hold it right there, Carol. We'll pick that up when we get back. This is Alan Smith for Paranormal Now on the Inception Radio Network, and I'm speaking with Carole Carle, who is a prolific storyteller of a true story, as we know, of the Fox sisters. And we'll find out more about that when we get back. Hang in there.
Hello, Inception Radio Network listeners. This is Amanda. Remember, you can take your Inception Radio shows on the go. Just download the Inception Radio Network app for your iPhone, iPad, or Android smartphones and access live shows, past shows, guest lineups, and much more. Just visit the iTunes Store or the Google Play Marketplace and download it today for free.
Welcome back to Paranormal Now. This is your host, Alan B. Smith, on the Inception Radio Network, and I am with another IRN host, Carole Carle. Let me actually tell you a little bit more about Carole Carle, because I think this would also help inform the story that we're telling as well. And for many of you who listen to the Inception Radio Network, you are familiar with her, but many of you, this is probably the first time hearing her brilliant voice on air. So, Carole Carle... So well, I've said it before. Carole Carle is definitely my favorite voice, at least on the Inception Radio Network, if not on all networks.
But Carole checks in the mail, Alan. Checks in the mail.
True story. But Carole Carle is the oldest daughter of Walter R. Carle and Lewis Carle. Carol's birth was actually announced in The Hollywood Reporter, as her father was then a news director and television news broadcaster in that city. Her mother sang live on the radio and was also a disc jockey back in the day. In Grand Rapids, Michigan, where the family moved when she was a child, Carle began doing musical theater in high school, and community theater followed. Eventually, the family moved back to L.A., where Carle found professional work and joined Actors Equity Association, the Stage Actors Union, and the Screen Actors Guild. Fascinated with all things paranormal since age 12, Carole could constantly be found lugging home the latest books from the library on UFOs, spirits of Charles-Fortean phenomena. For the past decade, Carole's research has centered on the Fox sisters, which we are talking about tonight, and the roots of American spiritualism. And as we mentioned before, she and her composer husband are in the later stages of completing a musical based on the Hydesville Rappings. And in the good spirit of the Hydesville Fox sister Rappings, taking us out of the break was Girls Just Want to Have Fun by Cyndi Lauper.
Perfect. Love her.
All right, Carole. So let's pick up the story. Where were we? I actually lost
we were. You made some brilliant point about souls and spirits, etc. I think we were sort of a little bit after that.
We were, but so the newspaper prints this article, and then there is an article written by someone else that derides
Yes.
them and then later retracts that.
Yes.
But by then the damage is already done on
that's
the
true.
reputation. So, and we were kind of moving a little bit through history, and I think that you're right with World War I, the Depression, World War II. So there were a lot of people that wanted to commune, but I think that the stigma was already there. So a lot of this was moving, like you said, to these sort of, guest invited seances that you didn't really advertise in the newspaper or share on the town hall bulletin.
Right.
It's like,
right. But it was just so widespread that, in a sense, because of the nature, I guess one could say, the societal placement of the individuals having these seances, it took on some form of something other than a parlor trick. There were just too many times when people were flabbergasted by the results. So, yeah, right.
Well,
this is
I don't know when do you think it's fair to say that with the New Age movement that the 80s was also sort of a rebirth of spiritualism in America? Or not, maybe not rebirth is the best word, but it was I guess reborn. I'm not sure. I'm lacking the best word to describe
I like
it.
that. Sort of
resurgence,
maybe the evolution, perhaps, of such, because the internet had been, referred to as a modern day non-spiritualist seance. The fact that I don't think there's anybody who has sleuthed around who hasn't stumbled upon something that seems like, whoa, this is synchronous, or this is the last thing I expected to stumble upon here, which kind of has, sometimes one can feel just, if you want to really go out there, one can feel led, directed by, I don't know, other intelligence. I cannot be more specific than that. I suppose it would be akin to intuition, hunches.
Yes, I mean, sometimes I wonder, could it be a higher intelligence or something, like you said, like an intuition? Maybe it's almost like your own soul, assuming you believe in a soul, or consciousness, if you believe that consciousness is beyond just the brain matter, can kind of expand out through time-space continuum a little bit ahead of you, and sort of make things happen to bring things to you. So like how our actual subconscious can be good for us because we do things without having to think.
Yes.
But it could also undermine us and do things we're not even aware of and go, what the hell? So maybe our super consciousness, our actual greater soul conscious, whatever it may be, can do similar things. I don't know.
Oh, I like that. Yikes.
And I wonder what did the Fox sisters believe in? I mean, did they have a firm spiritual belief of their own
in fact, they were initially Methodists, and I don't think they ever put that away. And in fact, each one of their seances was begun with a Christian hymn before they ever said a word to contact spirits. I see that as a kind of a preparation, a cleansing, putting them, and this was sung by everybody, everybody at the table. I'm not sure who called which hymn selection it was, but yeah. So I don't know. It's a real interesting thing. Most of the contact, outside of the time that the carpet balls were thrown across an attic in the direction of Calvin Brown in Rochester, carpet balls, those were pieces of yarn wrapped together, old fragments of clothing no longer in use, generally wool, that were then made into braids, which made rug balls. But they started as these carpet balls. And Calvin was apparently thoroughly pelted by the carpet balls being thrown by unseen hands.
And thoroughly pelted. It's kind of comical. I mean, it's better than being scratched.
It is definitely there. There isn't anything like that in at least Ann Leah's book, the entire book. She was, however, at one point, I remember reading this, and it was kind of a stretch for me to follow her around that corner, so to speak. But in the years that have transpired, all bets are off. She, at one point, Leah was physically lifted through the air up several feet at the landing of a staircase, and then gently placed back on the ground. That's a hard one. One hears so many modern-day spiritualists, ghost hunters, say, my partner was scratched, or one time was thrown across a room, that sort of thing. And it kind of fits. But the Fox sisters were, their torture, shall we say, was psychological. At one point, there was something going on in the house in Rochester, and Lizzie, who at that point was about 10, who was Anne Leah's daughter, was asked to join in prayers, and she said, "How can I pray when I feel more like swearing?" It was a hardship for everybody. Not something they brought on upon themselves. They were not in it for the fame or the money. Mm-hmm. There was no money.
Yeah, I was going to say,
definitely. Well, they were paid something. I can't tell you what the amounts were. They were more like offerings. And they also needed, the financial support from this. And that was definitely part of the reason that they did accept money. It became so bad that, for instance, Anne Leah, she didn't have any piano students, shall we say. It was just a bit too much for people. So sort of, they were given lemonade and they made lemon cookies. Lemons. Hello. Oh, I wrecked that. But you know where I'm going with it. It was not a happy time. And it became more unhappy. Maggie had an interesting marriage to Eliza Kent Kane, with a K-A-N-E, who was an Arctic explorer of all things. And his parents were so against it that they ultimately, ended the relationship. And that was part of what caused Maggie a lot of grief.
I see.
Yeah.
One would think that, I don't know. I guess what exactly do you think, historically, scared people? But did they really all think that they were witches, or did they just not trust them? Did they think they were liars? What scared people away most?
I think there was so much substantiation and accuracy involved in not only what they did, but the audience involved. Some of people who were, James Fenimore Cooper, Horace Greeley, Frederick Douglass, etc., Isaac and Amy Post, who were huge Quakers and abolitionists, very well known, and they came to the aid and support of the girls. And that, to me, speaks of something. Now, what frightened others, I don't know. Was it that could it have been something as curious as the fact that these respected citizens, pillars of the community, perhaps were in sway of the devil himself, and because of their power, that was off-putting? I don't know. I really don't have a clue. Perhaps it's just that the balance of people who were exposed to this information and turned their backs on it just weren't ready.
Yeah. And if for instance these were men, let's say, do you think would it make any difference at all, or would it have been the same situation?
Oh, no, that's a hard one. There was a man who did not indeed hold seances, but hold on, let me grab something. His name was he a doctor? No. Just John W. Edmonds. In fact, John was a judge. He lived 1816 to 1874. His public career, he was a member of both branches of the New York State Legislature, and for some time he was president of the Senate. He was a judge of the Supreme Court of New York, and he resigned that latter position because of his spiritual beliefs. He was interested in Rochester back, it says here, early in 1851. He had experiences published August 1st, 1853 in the New York Courier, an article to the public. And, here's what he says. It's pretty brief. And in a later letter published in the New York Herald, August 6th, 1853, Judge John Worth Edmonds wrote, "I went into the investigation, originally thinking it a deception and intending to make public my exposure of it. having, from my research, has come to a different conclusion, I feel that the obligation to make known the result is just as strong. Therefore, it is mainly that I give the result to the world. I say mainly because there is another consideration which influences me, and that is the desire to extend to others a knowledge which I am conscious cannot but make them happier and better. He just, became full, bold spiritualist. Mm-hmm. And so that gives you an idea. He did have personal experience with deaths in his family, I believe a daughter and ultimately his wife, but he had physiological implications. No, he wasn't scratched, but he was stuck. He was poked. His thigh would feel as though it was burning, and he had physiological connotations that compelled him to say, and this was simultaneous to his contact and attempt to contact spirits. So, he was pretty convinced.
Well, do you think because of his losses, do you think that he was he had a predilection to wanting to believe?
I know where you're going, and that is, well, isn't that just the hardest part? It's there are UFO witnesses and enthusiasts who have had one experience, and it marks them to the point where they're unobjective, and it seems to me that they continue then to, I don't want to say embellish, they retell, and in each telling, I guess we're talking the shaggy dog story, the fish story. And that's difficult because, there's something wrong when you believe something that you're semi-conscious is not exactly accurate. That's not, it's not forthcoming, to say the least.
Well, sure, yeah. I mean, you can apply that to anything
yes.
paranormal.
Right.
Certainly I've had experiences that I couldn't quite explain, but it doesn't mean they were exactly paranormal. I don't have to take that leap, but I keep my mind open to thinking that it might have been. But yeah, and I mean, sure, but in his case, I mean, there's something emotional.
Yes.
So while his words are well formed, I do wonder if he just really wanted to believe, and if he made a pronouncement in such a manner, it sort of would protect himself from doing the things like I've checked into this, it's real, therefore, and without saying it, I'm not crazy.
Oh, and, okay, yes. Mm-hmm. A substantiation of credibility. Yes. And it's so difficult to assess, even if you know somebody. It can be difficult to assess exactly where they're coming from on the subject. If there is, a predisposition, a predilection, as you said, to want it to be true. I want to believe, right?
Sure. And the body that they found in the wall,
yes.
Other than, is it, according to their skill set, was it somewhat dateable? How long it was in there? Could scientists or investigators look at it and say, yeah, that's about the right timeline. It rotted and dried as such,
right,
as we would expect.
It was, well, at that point it was only bones, and I just absolutely cannot. I've never found anything by way of a document or any sort of autopsy or any sort of research done. I'm assuming that it was a headless set of bones, because his head was ultimately, and I don't even know when this was and whether this is just wild, confabulation. His head, ultimately, the skull was found somewhere else, close to the cottage. So, but, that's an interesting question. I wonder whether, I know the National Spiritualist Association that houses the body and his tin peddler box at Lilydale,
they have the body.
Yes. And see, once again, we have a, and in fact, there was, in the past decade, there's been, the original cottage was moved to Lilydale, and it burned, or was burned, I believe in the 1950s. So the foundation remains, and there was some stuff done to protect this and make it, a national kind of, not technically an absolute historic site, but to protect it, et cetera. And I guess there is some tourism to it. My big question, of course, is, can't somebody spring for getting some sort of DNA analysis? I'm not sure what could be substantiated. I don't know, ethnicity. So we could substantiate this was, a Jewish individual. And we could also possibly do the timeline. I have no idea.
Yeah, possibly. Yeah, I was thinking then, what else did they find? I mean, were there clothing that was, still hanging from the body, or, how
No, and in fact, the only thing, this is grisly, the only thing I can say about the clothing is that at least there is, in E.E. Lewis, the Esquire, the attorney's, I have to say that or he'll come back and haunt me, the attorney's depositions, there's evidence that for certain Lucretia Pulver, the serving girl who was in residence at the Bell Cottage at that point at the time of the murder, was given a peddler's coat. She recognized it as the coat worn by Charles B. Rosner, the peddler. And
so he was stripped down completely. We think.
I believe he was. I know the coat was ripped where they found the $500 hidden in the lining. So we know that the coat at least was removed. There was a movement. In fact, somebody went to the courthouse, Batavia, New York, and tried to bring this to a trial. During this, right sort of in the months after, because it was as though we cannot let this murdering John C. Bell walk. He can't go free. We have evidence by spiritual contact that he murdered someone, Charles B. Rosner, and we just can't let him walk. And the judge, and it went as far as the judge got in front of a judge. Now, obviously not Judge John Worth Edmonds. No, he was later. That would have been perfect. The judge said, I cannot try something on the words, the testimony of a spirit. That's just not, it isn't the kind of witness we have in mind, blah, blah, blah. It's curious. The idea of taking it to trial was undersigned by all kinds of members of the community of Hydesville, who then, at the end of this tract, this long pamphlet published by E.E. Lewis, all of these individuals, exclusively male, came forward and said that we are not accusing John C. Bell. They redacted their accusations, blah, blah, blah. So, it's early political stuff going on there.
Yeah, I mean, we see that even today.
Oh, we do.
Mm-hmm. Like I said, as long as ghosts are around, we'll be having the same social problems too.
That's there's a thought.
Hopefully not. Who knows? Maybe 1,000 years from now we'll be naturally evolved, and all this will be left behind. Okay, so was there anything else that we're missing as a part of the story so far?
Well, they're not exactly, no, because they, the girls, everybody's gone now. There is not, I don't think, any direct kin around. The girls are buried in, I want to say, Greenview Cemetery, someplace in the state of New York. If their graves are available. It always gives me a giggle to think how little known this is when, my gosh, you think of all the ghost hunting shows, et cetera, et cetera. And yet the roots of this are just not very well known. There's a big interest in South America. In fact, there's a YouTube, I can't recall the title, it's just as well. It's a hilarious version of some sort of local show. It's a play. What you see is, you see a man with a blonde wig, braids, okay, and he's dressed up like a little girl, and another one similar, and those are the Fox sisters, and there's a spirit. It's sung in Spanish, and it's Hydesville is what they keep repeating. So it's a very interesting thing. There was interest in South America. There was even some sort of a 3-act play at one time presented. Oh, and there's something called the Jiva or Giva. I'm not sure how it's pronounced. Geva. It's an equity house, in fact, Allison, in Rochester. And they did something about 10 years ago. It was a play written by a man named Dan O'Brien. It was simply a 2-act stage play without music about the Fox sisters. From the reviews I read, he took it into the dark part which is just someplace we sort of made our choice not to go because it's not, at least it wasn't the interpretation that jumped out to us to take it dark.
Mm-hmm. So what is your interpretation then?
That this was the first contact made with a purpose of perhaps something to do with Charles' 5 children. And there was never a message that I came across to really substantiate that, to indicate it. It was almost as though this was a first time, this was a breakthrough in contact, the way it was became so well known and was so witnessed by so many different kinds of people over a long stretch of time. I think it was a beginning that somehow got lost in the shuffle, lost in the zeitgeist.
So are you saying it's something like a ghost's version of being a prophet, kind of, breaking the mold and setting forth a new paradigm, or?
Oh, that's good. Yeah, I like that. Yeah.
Okay, you can.
and why?
So do you think that? No, go ahead.
No. It's just no. That's really something to ponder. And then, for me, the question is, then what happened? Where is the real specific follow-up? It's not that it all went away, but it sort of went quiet. And yep, we've got media that's filled with people who talk to spirit, and people who talk to spirits of the people sitting in their gallery, during these events. It's almost impossible to say who's accurate, who is truthful. It's just really dicey. I try never to form an opinion, that open mind thing, and it's hard to do because there are times when what my gut is saying is, oh my gosh, this is absolute hogwash. This is so contrived, and some of it is. But I think for every bit that is hogwash, there's some legit. I think all of us have the ability to have these experiences. And I don't know why it's difficult for some to even admit that, and others it's like, yeah, what's your point? And I don't know what makes I don't know what the components are. I don't have a clue.
Yeah, I don't know. But I do wonder, in the house in Lilydale,
yes.
Are there any signs of happenings, of communication, of haunting?
I have not. Now that is something that is fascinating. And you bring up a very good point. I have not read of anything like that. I haven't read of even any attempts, although I definitely, it's not something I check every day, and I could have missed something, but I don't recall seeing information about any kind of local seance to attempt to reach these individuals. And that's sort of a mind blow. I mean, like, why not? Isn't that the logical step?
Sure. Or maybe it's been done, they're just not sharing it because they don't want it to be like a tourist attraction. Because, just because you're a spiritualist living in Lilydale doesn't mean you don't have to do some things that are private unto yourself. So perhaps.
Oh, that's excellent. And that has never occurred to me. Wow.
All right, cool. So
yikes, Alan, you're shaking me up here.
We're coming up on the third and final break. You're listening to Paranormal Now on the Inception Radio Network, and I'm fortunate to be speaking with Carole Carle, who I've known as a virtual friend for years, and I say that because we've not yet met in person, but we'll someday.
Yeah.
But maybe you'll get your musical into New York, and then that'll be fantastic.
From your mouth to whoever's ears.
Right.
Oh,
right.
Yeah.
May it be so. Okay, so hang in there, and when we come back for the last quarter of the show, Carole Carle covers so many topics because she does the daily headline news on the Inception Radio Network. So she is quite attuned to the many trends that are going on in the world of ufology and the paranormal. So we'll ask her a little bit about that when we get back for the final quarter, and you definitely don't want to miss it because she knows of some of the most spectacular stories that you'll hear. So hang in there.
And I can make weird noises too.
Right, because if I say it with an accent, and if I say it with an accent, it makes it more fascinating.
Okay.
All right, Alan B. Smith on Paranormal Now. Hang in there, we'll be right back. Welcome back to Paranormal Now. This is Alan B. Smith. I am your host tonight, and my kind of a co-host, because we've co-hosted before, is Carole Carle from the Inception Radio Network. She's also the voice of the UFO headline news that you hear 5 days a week on the Inception Radio Network. Is it more than 5 days a week, or is it just Monday through Friday?
Oh my gosh! I was just about to sort of do this shameless, UFO headline news plug. We have expanded. My producer, Joe Champion, Inception Radio Network, etc., he had this great idea for a title, Off the Beaten Path. I had wanted for a long time to take the news sort of outside the box, not just UFOs, but things of antiquity, I can't say it, old things that might connect, also to UFOs peripherally, Egyptology, cryptozoology, etc., the Sasquatch and Bigfoot and Chupacabra and, the Nessie, the Loch Ness Monster. So, and all of these things, they do connect, I think, and it's just a question of, how they do connect. But so, anyway, back to your question, yes. The weekend, Saturday and Sunday, are a new broadcast, UFO headline news, Off the Beaten Path.
This is really exciting.
Fun.
Yeah, and how long have you been doing it for?
No, let's see. I think we're coming up on 4 or 5 weekends now.
Okay, nice.
But it's all, we're on iHeartRadio and YouTube and Earth Mysteries News, et cetera, lots of platforms. Just, if you type in ufoheadlinenews.com, that'll take you to many sites. That's the specific one. But yeah, it's, somehow, actually, we just lost Jim Mars. And I just... personally speaking, I never got a chance to meet him, but his voice was the first voice I heard coming out of Inception Radio Network, and it brought me back to the network, and I landed in the chat room, and after a certain length of time there, I got invited to, you had mentioned I had done other shows on the network in your wonderful intro. Thank you very much. Yes, Fringe Radio with Pat Daniels and Carole, who used to be on out of a land-based station out of Utah. And they would broadcast, I think it was 6 nights a week. It was it 4 hours a night? It was heaven. And at one point they had a guest on, and I called in and asked the guest a question, and she was a spiritualist. And it ended up in me being asked in chat by Pat and Carole to do their show. Oh my gosh. So I cobbled a bunch of stuff together and ultimately did their show, which it morphed into Heidi Hollis, the Outlander, asking me to do her show. And I guess it was the transfer of my bio and credits or something to Joe Champion, and next thing I knew, I was being invited to join the UFO Headline News team. Oh my God. It was hilarious because there's a wonderful broadcaster. You can still hear her interstitially, Amanda. And I remember listening to her news and saying out loud, Amanda, I want your job. Yeah. Well, we shared the job for a while, and then she got too busy eventually to do it. So, and then Herman Rohr, who was our other broadcaster, also got too busy. So here I am. Yes. Oh, twist my arm. It is delightful.
And how does the editing process work for that? I mean, do you do all the editing yourself for the copy, or?
Yeah, it was someone tossed into tech waters way over her head. I had done a lot of research and stuff, and I knew how to, copy and paste and file and print and stuff like that. But lo and behold, I learned Audacity, the waveform thing, so you can record it yourself, which I do. And finding the content, that's not the hard part. It's the vetting process that sometimes is a little lengthy. I'll come upon stories, and unless I can, double check at least if the source is flaky or I'm not familiar with it, I just don't do it. I've only done one witness first-person report from a website I won't name, and one of my colleagues shamed me for reading it. Yes, I read it. It was lengthy. It was pretty much an eye roll, and so I don't go far out anymore. I learned my lesson. So, and then again, it's anybody's guess when you're reading a UFO report sent in by a witness who's not identified. It's anybody's guess when they say that they know aircraft, they've worked on aircraft, they were with this or that branch of the military, and they know that what they saw isn't something that, is your average run-of-the-mill something we see in the sky. And you have to take that at face value. Occasionally someone will leave their name or a contact phone number in their sighting. I get the sightings for the most part from UFO Stalker. And they're also a huge database, ufostalker.com, and then it's some of it is transferred and edited somewhat and put on the UFO Chronicles website, another goodie. Also, openminds.tv, they're fantastic. I am so indebted to all these journalists, especially the science writers who put it in what I call the Goldilocks zone. It's a space term, but it's that, it's not too long, not too short, not too dumbed down, not too technical, and something that doesn't deteriorate quickly into, onion-esque territory, shall we say.
Sure.
So, yeah, that's a job. It's become a lot easier. I think this is about the 4th year I've done this, and I've pretty much got it down to a pseudoscience.
All right. Well, then, everybody, light your incense, light your candles. We'll let Carole Carle tell us about some of the most intriguing stories to come to light. And and taking us out of the break, speaking of candles, was Candela by Buena Vista Social Club. I am interested because when we had spoken earlier, you had mentioned that you feel like there are certain things within the UFO eyewitness accounts, perhaps, that seem to be trending, that is not getting much coverage. Am I correct on that?
Well, an interesting thing trending is, and coverage, because that's anybody's guess. Occasionally, as I gather content, I'll notice that, yikes, is there a hot spot developing down here around Houma, Louisiana? What's up with that? And, there was recently kind of a cluster in Michigan. Those are interesting things, especially when the nature of the report tallies, and these are independent witnesses as far as anybody can tell. The thing that's currently seen, I would say, no, Cheryl Costa, who writes for the Syracuse New Times, and she has that she and her spouse Linda have the UFO desktop reference. Oh my gosh. I cover her columns frequently on the news, and she just has a very interesting take on things. She writes kind of it's interesting, it's societal, sociological and space UFO kind of stuff. But she has chronicled a lot of orange spheres, which fly in pairs. She would be the go-to person, or her book, in terms of how many of each category are seen. The ones that creep me out when I look at these photos, they're photos that, as far as I can, I'm certainly, not the MUFON guy, Mark D'Antonio. I cannot really, photo analysis is not exactly it's not at all my area of expertise. But sometimes there are photos that clearly, just one glance and you can say, yeah, well, there should be shadow here, and so this is probably CGI, it's a hoax, blah, blah. There are a lot of photos I've come across that are very strange. They're circular, and often the circular has a diffused kind of cloudy, hazy area at the edge, and in the center there's a dot, or there's something. Some of these things that are more specifically detailed in the photographs look like nothing more than a kind of cell under a microscope. You can't actually see the movement in the still shots. You can't see the movement or the morphing, the traveling the way a cell would, but they just look biological, somehow organic. And for some reason, they personally kind of make me go, ew, I wish it wasn't so late at night and I just looked at that. Okay. That's interesting. The other thing is this sort of continuing saga of witnesses reporting they see an object, and then beat, wait for it, here come either the F-16, F-15 jets chasing it, or black helicopters. Yeah, you know that meme, yeah.
Yeah, and that's usually followed by a report saying, no, we didn't send anything out. And then a week later, oh, well, we did, but we weren't chasing. It was a part of a routine thing.
Yes.
It's the same story. It's like they have the same rap almost every time you hear these reports.
Right. It's like, how foolish and gullible do they think we are? You know, it's just and there's something, you know, the idea that the average individual, as far as I can perceive, has a new interest in verifying news and news sources. I mean, you know, faux news. I was thinking about that today. Faux news, F-A-U-X, pronounced faux. Well, it's F-O-E news, isn't it? It's faux news. This is news that isn't our friend.
Yeah,
and,
you know, it really bothers me because, you know, especially when you become accustomed to the paranormal world and the news of the paranormal.
Yes.
You know, like you said, you look at the photo, you analyze, you keep an open mind, you read, but you know, you are looking, your eyes are open to scan for fraudulent. Sometimes, you know, people share all kinds of stories because they're fun.
Yes.
But on the Paranormal Now Facebook page, and this is not to knock anybody else, but because of the recent problems we have with fake news, I'm very careful about what articles I share on there. I want to feel that there's at least something valid about that article. I don't want it to just be someone's idea that they just wrote on a literally like a website they created to make look like a news website and then write an article.
Yep.
And I think that it's not just us, but everybody should do this. I mean, you know, someone called me out once. I posted something on Facebook, and they're like, hey, you know, the source you're getting from this, you know, it's definitely slanted towards this way of a political persuasion. And I was like, you know what? You know, I'm kind of calling the black kettle here. You know,
yes.
You know, so and I was like, I'm glad you called me out on that, you know, because now I'm extra careful about, you know, the things that I share and post, and I'm doing it for myself too, because especially if you're into UFOs and you had an experience and you really believe it, it only makes sense that you'd want to be a little bit more vigorous about your claims and what you choose to believe. I mean, don't you want to believe the truth and not something proposed that is 100% speculation?
Oh, you know, that's it. And what a slippery slope, because, you know, whose truth is the ultimate truth. And, you know, the constant, the leitmotif of witnesses is, I know what I saw, you know. And in fact, didn't James Fox use that as a title for one of his documentaries regarding the Phoenix Lights? Yeah. And it's sort of you know, it's just, I saw something once with my family in the sky, and it was very strange because it sort of began with Carole, go out and look up at the sky. I don't know. I was doing something mundane, Alan, like laundry, you know, and it was like, oh, yeah, right. Like, what? No, Carole, go out and look at the sky. Now, it's interesting. I've been asked, was that an internal voice? Was it the sound of my voice? Was it, what was that? I don't know. It was just a sense. I did not hear any other voice with any other character, inflection, dialect, you know, tonal quality. No, it was just a sense of, so I went out and looked at the sky. I went out actually the front door, which was the most convenient, and I went down the front porch steps and looked up at the sky, and I don't know, probably, you know, if straight ahead was 12 o'clock, this would have been like 2 o'clock over me, was what I can only describe as a yellow sky snake. That's kind of what we came to call it. It was moving. There wasn't any wind. It was probably, you know, 5 o'clock-ish in the afternoon. And this thing was moving in such a way that it looked like a water snake moving through water, but it was something yellow in the sky. I would say maybe 100 feet long. How high it was, probably less than 300 feet. And it stayed there long enough for me to go inside and, you know, get my son and daughter and my husband, and we all watched this until it just got so high we couldn't see it. And I have found some shots of something similar, and I don't even remember the geolocation, but yeah, it was definitely something strange. And of course, the onset of it, how it came about, was also very curious. There is that thing, social contact is a big deal with UFOs now. Not social, conscious contact. Well, who knows, maybe it is social, but conscious contact, the calling up of UFOs. A lot of research groups have had some success.
Yeah. Well, talking to Dr. Burks, who you are familiar with.
Yes,
Joseph Burks,
speaking of contact, right.
Yeah, right. He and I had that discussion too, and he said, I can't explain it, but for some reason people will be going through a period of time where they're able to call down, or whatever term you would like to use, terminology,
right.
a UFO or what have you. And then it would pass, and it might come back, it may not. It's a very odd thing, because I asked him, and I'm sure you'll remember Prophet
yes, Yahweh. Yes, okay.
Yeah, and that was a perfect example. I mean, I literally looked at this video and my mind is blown, because he's doing this, like the video with a news reporter, and so this wasn't staged. It was astounding that this guy was able to do this, and then he disappeared, and I don't know.
Yeah, what happened to him? Was there a punchline with that?
No. I think what happened to him is he probably, like we had Dr. Burtz and I had discussed, is that at some point he probably was unable to do it, and so. Imagine how easy it is to call someone a charlatan when, let's say, for 2 years you're able to do this thing, and then you go, oh, meet me here, I'm going to do it, and it doesn't happen. Oh, meet me here, I'm going to do it, and then it doesn't happen.
Yes.
And you don't know why.
Stops. Yes.
Exactly.
It goes, from whence it came. That's something that happened to the Fox sisters. In fact, there's a little parallel. Just briefly, there was a time when spirit stopped contacting them. They had no idea why. They felt abandoned. They felt that they had signed on for this ultimately because they had no choice. And, they were going forward with it, and there was no contact. They didn't fake anything, and ultimately spirits returned. And the title for that chapter in Leah's book, which is The Missing Link of Modern Spiritualism, by the way. It's hard to find. It's easier now. There are a few more copies. But, right, she that's something she notes in the book. The chapter title is Adieu from the Spirits. Yes, they kind of left, but they came back. So Yahweh, that's, it's very interesting. That idea of moving through a time when you can contact, and then for some reason there is no contact. That's very, very curious.
Curious and probably frustrating as hell. But you had mentioned that you noticed a sort of like biological somethingness.
Yes, the yellow sky snake. Yep. Or in the photos, which
in the photos, right? And I'm wondering.
Yes.
Is there a trend going on with that specifically, or is it just because we're getting better photos?
Oh, yeah. Now, see, that's something that one, I suppose, could find some sort of demographic, some sort of stats on that. There was something about a year ago. There was a sighting in upstate New York, reported to UFO stalker, and obviously, because the news is not video, I can only refer to the links that can show the photos, but I often will sort of, attempt to give a description of them, to describe the indescribable. There was a gentleman who photographed from his window, and you can see, there's sort of a backup camera at some point. You can see him photographing out the window. And yet, this has a bare bones legitimacy. It doesn't seem like something that was staged. And what he photographs and gets close-ups, zooms in on, is, again, this circular object with a haze at the outside, something in the center. And in this case, Alan, it was sort of like, oh, okay, this is creep out level number 10, and I'm just going to go away now. I had to leave those shots because, and especially the video footage, because this object, this circular thing with the stuff in the middle, began to morph. You could see it sort of moving around. In this case, it was moving like a cell under a microscope. and it morphed into sort of a rectangular shape, and then sort of a lozenge shape, and ultimately disappeared, moved farther away, and vanished.
It's so bizarre.
It is.
Travis Waltman, didn't he describe that the inside of the UFO is almost organic?
Interesting. I remember that.
Or organic elements to it, or
yes, it's something to do with some. At one point, was he close to what looked like a control panel?
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of a takeaway that I have, right? And I wish I could remember that facet of it that was the organic part. I love that quote. I'm hoping it's not apocryphal. The quote that came around about 5 years ago from Travis Walton, that if he had it to do over again, he would never have gotten out of that truck.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And then, but the lovely takeaway from that is that I believe at this point he feels that he was harmed, he was damaged by whatever blue ray came out of the bottom of that craft initially, and that he was taken into the ship and they worked on him. They repaired the damage that had been done.
Like almost as if it was an accident.
Yes.
Right.
I like that.
That's nice. But then they need to get better cameras on their UFOs so they can stop beaming people accidentally.
Whoops. Yeah, exactly.
Unless someone was training that day, I don't know, but
that could be.
Because when you're riding the trains in New York, you know when somebody's training.
Really? Oh my gosh!
Oh my God! The brakes to stop, and everyone's like rocking in the train. You get seasick.
Yeah. They should give free rides on those days.
They should. That's a good idea.
Yeah. Well, something else I wanted to touch on briefly is an interesting uptick on the take of, well, it's cartoon strips. For instance, the cartoon strips that run in the Los Angeles Times. I won't even begin to name them, but I would say every other one deals with either a UFO abduction or a flying saucer scene or aliens coming down to do this or that. I mean, and one of them is even currently referring to Alan Stern, who's one of the honchos at NASA, using him by name. And they've got a website that, anybody reading can link to get scientific NASA information. So, and then, of course, there's that NASA joke, never a straight answer, NASA. Yeah. But I just find it very interesting. There just seems to be sort of an extra interest. Maybe there's a correlation to people paying attention to alternative news sources. I don't know what accounts for it, but it's definitely, definitely that the UFO and alien references are like, I don't remember ever having seen them before.
And what do you think is the cause?
I don't. Oh, you ask me all these wonderful questions that I can't answer. Oh, no, this is terrific. This is what it's all about. But I don't know. I'm pretty sure we could go onto some forums, that we could access in 30 seconds or less, and find out that there is a conspiracy, that all of this is part of a run-up to a big event. A bunch of guys in, as Ian Punnett, that wonderful DJ from Coast to Coast, used to say, a bunch of guys in loose cahoots, and that we were moving toward some sort of false flag, some sort of anti, and that even talk of disclosure is part of that. And I don't think that, I'm not really in that line of folks at this point, although things could change. There was talk during the exercise, was it this last summer, the Jade Helm exercise, I think primarily in Texas.
That was a couple years ago, actually. Yeah.
Geez, time, time flies when you're reporting on
I remember everybody made such a big deal about it, and then nothing happened.
No, you could also read some comments under some of the articles at your own risk that indicated that this is, same old. They had been doing these exercises, and the community was not only very much aware but accepting of it. They made everybody at home and got out of the way when they had to.
Yeah.
So no,
it wasn't the end of the world. They weren't taking over Texas, and no. But we have a handful of minutes left. So if there's anything else you want to focus on, you jump in there.
Well, I don't know. I would say at this point it's all kind of a blur. I think of it as a friendly blur. I've had this idea that everything is connected for such a long time. I don't even remember when that, it coalesces as the days go by and the years go by. I don't know. It's, I like your tagline, live in the mystery. And boy, we sure are.
Yeah. And I think that for one, you can't really do much about it anyway. But two, I feel like that there's a kind of a, I don't know, there's a peace in it, much like when you finally accept life, that you'll never hit this absolute peak of happiness, because life is constantly up and down. So there's no like, I finally got there, I am happy and I'm going to stay happy for the rest of my life. I think it's of the same vein. It's like just like sort of embracing, letting go and enjoying the mystery, and to me that's where the real joy of it all comes in, is accepting that I'm not always going to know the answer, but chasing the answer is fun.
It is fun. And don't we stumble upon other things that seem like clues? I think that really would sum it up. The other day it occurred to me that I don't remember a time in my life when I wasn't looking for clues. I don't even know, no Sherlock here. You're right, by the way, he would have loved the Fox Sister story. Arthur Conan Doyle. And in fact, he had his own touch with spiritualism. But it's almost as though there's a part we're not supposed to know. Do you get that feeling?
I do. I don't know if it's a real thing, but I get that sense. Absolutely. Yeah. That there is, and this term is thrown all over the place depending on the subject matter, but there is a sort of veil that is obscuring our full vision or knowledge, and but I think sometimes people do tap beyond that, but to stay permanently tapped into the all-knowing, I don't think would be human then. So maybe there's a good reason for it if that's true.
Interesting. And what just went through my mind is the Zen proverb. I'm probably paraphrasing, but it's before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I
somewhere here.
Yeah. I often get that sense. There's the everyday living. No matter what it is, you can, good or bad. And I think, I can get. We can accomplish. I'm stuttering here, but we can. I'm so excited. We can accomplish so many things as humans, but sometimes just the most simplest things are the most spiritual things. I just feel like the walk in the woods is probably more profound than building a coffee table. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they're the same. Anyway, we've got a few seconds left, Carole. I want to thank you so much for being on the Inception Radio Network on Paranormal Now. And if anybody wants to find anything else more about you besides going to Inception Radio Network, where should they go?
That's just about my one and only place that I hang out these days, info-wise. And I want to thank you while we have a second here. This has been a delight, Alan. Oh,
thank you, Carole. I appreciate it. It's always a pleasure to speak with you anyway, no matter on the air or off the air. And
exactly.
So thank you again. This is Alan B. Smith for Paranormal Now, and I want to thank also Joe Champion, MJ Lucas, and Bob Tarmac for making this station, the station too, and this program possible. All right, everybody, thank you very much. Until next time, live in the mystery.